Marcus Sterling adjusted his platinum cufflinks as he strode through the marble lobby of Sterling Industries, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the polished floors with the precision of a metronome. The 20-story glass tower in downtown Seattle bore his family name in gleaming letters, a monument to 3 generations of business acumen and ruthless ambition. At 34, Marcus had transformed his grandfather's modest shipping company into a multinational logistics empire, and he wore that achievement like armor against anyone who dared question his authority. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast sharp shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows as Marcus entered the executive elevator, his reflection multiplied in its mirrored walls. He barely noticed the cleaning cart being wheeled past by a small, elderly woman in a faded blue uniform. Maria Gonzalez had been invisible to him for the 18 months she'd worked the night shift. Just another cog in the machinery that kept his building pristine for the important people who conducted real business within its walls. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling," his assistant Jennifer called out as he swept past her desk without acknowledgment. She had learned long ago not to expect pleasantries from her boss before his first espresso and morning briefing. Marcus disappeared into his corner office, a cathedral of success with its panoramic view of Elliott Bay, and walls lined with awards, certificates, and photographs of him shaking hands with politicians and industry titans. The morning that would change everything began like any other. Marcus was reviewing quarterly projections when his phone buzzed with a text from his interior designer, Vivian Cross. The message was brief but urgent. "Emergency at the office. The Rothschild piece for the main conference room has been damaged in shipping. Need immediate replacement for tomorrow's board meeting with international investors. Can you approve emergency budget for substitute artwork?" Marcus cursed under his breath. The quarterly board meeting was Sterling Industries' most important event of the year, where they would present their expansion into European markets to a consortium of investors from London, Paris, and Berlin. The conference room had been meticulously designed to project power and sophistication, and the centerpiece was supposed to be a $1 million abstract painting by renowned artist Helena Rothschild. The symbolism wasn't lost on him. Commissioning work from Europe's most celebrated contemporary artist would signal Sterling Industries' readiness to compete on the global stage. "Find something," he texted back. "Budget is irrelevant. Just make sure it's impressive." By noon, Vivian had called with disappointing news. Every gallery in Seattle with pieces worthy of the Sterling Industries boardroom was either closed for renovations, had nothing available for immediate purchase, or was asking prices that even Marcus found excessive for a one-day solution. The Rothschild piece wouldn't arrive until the following week, leaving a glaring empty wall where the focal point of the room should be. "What about rentals?" Marcus asked, pacing behind his desk as he spoke into his Bluetooth headset. "I've exhausted every option," Vivian replied, her usually composed voice tinged with frustration. "The few pieces available either clash with the room's color scheme or aren't substantial enough to anchor the space. We're looking at a bare wall for the most important presentation of the year." Marcus ended the call and stared out at the city below, his mind racing through alternatives. The international investors would expect nothing less than perfection. They were old-world aristocrats with centuries of refined taste, and their decision to partner with Sterling Industries would hinge not just on financial projections, but on their perception of the company's cultural sophistication. An empty wall in the boardroom would be interpreted as either poor planning or, worse, American provincialism. As evening approached and the building began to empty, Marcus found himself working late, still searching online galleries for any piece that might salvage tomorrow's presentation. The cleaning crew had arrived for their night shift, and he could hear the distant hum of vacuum cleaners and the soft clanking of supply carts making their rounds through the building. It was nearly 10 o'clock when Marcus decided to inspect the conference room one final time, hoping to find some way to disguise the empty wall or rearrange the furniture to minimize its impact. As he pushed open the heavy wooden doors, he was surprised to find someone inside. Maria Gonzalez was methodically wiping down the mahogany table, her movements careful and precise as she cleaned each leather chair. She looked up when he entered, her dark eyes wide with surprise. "Oh, Mr. Sterling," she said in accented English, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry." "I can finish later." "No, continue. Marcus said dismissively, walking to the far end of the room where the missing artwork should have been displayed. He barely glanced at Maria as she continued her work, his attention focused on the architectural disaster of the blank wall. The space looked even more cavernous and incomplete than he had imagined. As Maria moved her supplies toward the exit, Marcus noticed something leaning against her cleaning cart that he hadn't seen before. It was a canvas, roughly 3 feet by 4 feet, wrapped in a plastic garbage bag but with one corner exposed. Through the clear plastic, he could make out vibrant colors and bold brushstrokes that seemed oddly sophisticated for what he assumed was some kind of amateur hobby piece. "What's that?" he asked, more out of idle curiosity than genuine interest. Maria paused, her weathered hands tightening on the cart handle. "It's nothing, sir. Just something I was throwing away." The dismissiveness in her voice sparked Marcus's attention. In his experience, people only claimed something was worthless when they were either embarrassed by it or trying to hide its true value. He walked over to her cart and gestured toward the wrapped canvas. "Let me see it." Maria's reluctance was palpable, but she couldn't refuse a direct request from the building's owner. With obvious hesitation, she pulled the plastic away to reveal a stunning oil painting. The work depicted a stormy seascape with dramatic lighting that seemed to emanate from within the canvas itself. The technique was masterful, bold, confident strokes that captured both the violence and beauty of nature in a way that immediately commanded attention. The composition was sophisticated, balancing traditional maritime themes with a modern sensibility that felt both timeless and contemporary. Marcus stared at the painting, his initial surprise giving way to genuine admiration. The piece had exactly the kind of gravitas and emotional impact that the conference room needed. The color palette would work perfectly with the room's design scheme, and the maritime theme would resonate with Sterling Industries' shipping heritage, while projecting the kind of cultural refinement that would impress European investors. "Where did this come from?" he asked, his tone sharpening with interest. "I found it in the storage room downstairs," Maria replied quickly. "It was just taking up space, so I thought I would dispose of it." Marcus studied the painting more closely, noting the professional quality of the canvas and frame. Someone had invested significant money in the materials alone, and the execution suggested serious artistic training. This wasn't the work of a weekend hobbyist or corporate art program cast-off. "Who painted it?" Maria's hesitation was more pronounced this time. "I don't know, sir. There was no information with it." Marcus's business instincts, honed by years of negotiations and acquisitions, told him there was more to this story. The painting was far too sophisticated to have been abandoned in a storage room, and Maria's obvious discomfort suggested she knew more than she was revealing. But at that moment, his immediate concern was the next morning's presentation. "I'll take it," he announced, lifting the canvas from her cart. "This will work perfectly for tomorrow's meeting." "Sir," Maria began, her voice carrying a note of urgency. "Perhaps you should." "That will be all." Marcus cut her off, already envisioning how the painting would transform the conference room. "You can finish cleaning here tomorrow night." As Maria gathered her supplies and left, Marcus propped the painting against the wall where the Rothschild piece should have been. Even in the conference room's dim evening lighting, the work commanded attention. The stormy seascape seemed to pulse with life, its dramatic contrasts creating depth and movement that would serve as a perfect backdrop for tomorrow's high-stakes presentation. Marcus pulled out his phone and called Vivian. "Crisis averted," he said when she answered. "I found a piece that will work perfectly." "You found something? Where?" "It doesn't matter. Just get here early tomorrow to help me hang it properly." The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, Seattle's typical autumn weather, providing an appropriately dramatic atmosphere for Sterling Industries' most important board meeting of the year. Marcus arrived at the office before dawn, his usual pre-presentation ritual of reviewing every detail that might influence the outcome. The international investors would arrive at 9, followed by the full board at 9:30, with the formal presentation beginning at 10. Vivian arrived at 7:30 with her installation equipment, and Marcus led her to the conference room where the painting still leaned against the wall. When she saw it, her expression shifted from professional efficiency to genuine surprise. "Marcus, where did you get this? Does it matter? Will it work for the presentation?" Vivian approached the painting, studying it with the trained eye of someone who had spent 2 decades in the art world. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. She examined the brushwork, the composition, the quality of the materials, and the way the light played across the surface. Her silence stretched long enough to make Marcus impatient. "Well?" "It's extraordinary," she said finally. "The technique is masterful. This is museum-quality work." "Perfect. Let's get it hung." As they positioned the painting on the wall, Vivian continued her examination. "The style reminds me of the Spanish masters, but with a contemporary sensibility that's quite remarkable. Are you sure you don't know the artist?" Marcus was adjusting the lighting to best showcase the piece when something caught his attention. In the bottom right corner of the canvas, barely visible unless viewed from the correct angle, was a small signature. The paint was slightly raised, suggesting it had been applied with a palette knife in the traditional manner of serious artists. He leaned closer, squinting to make out the letters. When he finally deciphered the signature, his blood turned to ice. "M. Esperanza," he read aloud, the name falling from his lips like a stone. Vivian froze in the middle of adjusting the lighting. Slowly, she turned to face him, her expression a mixture of disbelief and dawning recognition. "Did you just say Monsieur Esperanza?" Marcus nodded, unable to speak as the implications crashed over him like a tidal wave. Maria Esperanza was not just any artist. She was one of the most celebrated painters of the late 20th century, a Spanish master whose work hung in the Prado, the Louvre, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Her paintings regularly sold at auction for millions of dollars, and she had been particularly renowned for her seascapes, dramatic, emotionally charged works that captured the power and mystery of the ocean with unprecedented skill. But Maria Esperanza had disappeared from the art world 25 years ago, at the height of her fame. One day she was the toast of international art circles, commanding unprecedented prices and critical acclaim. The next, she had vanished without explanation, leaving behind only rumors and speculation about what had driven one of Europe's most successful artists into self-imposed exile. "This can't be possible," Marcus whispered, staring at the signature as if it might change before his eyes. Vivian was already pulling out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen as she searched for information. Within moments, she had pulled up images of authenticated Maria Esperanza works from major auction houses and museums. The similarities were undeniable. The same bold brushwork, the same mastery of light and shadow, the same ability to infuse maritime scenes with profound emotional depth. "Marcus," Vivian said, her voice barely controlled, "if this is a genuine Maria Esperanza, you're looking at a painting worth somewhere between $5 and $8 million. The room spun around Marcus as he processed this information. The cleaning lady whose name he had never bothered to learn, whom he had dismissed as invisible and inconsequential, was Maria Esperanza, one of the most important artists of the modern era. The woman he had ordered around, whose work he had nearly allowed to be thrown away as garbage, was a master whose creations were treasured in the world's most prestigious museums. "She tried to tell me," Marcus said, the memory of the previous night flooding back with painful clarity. "When I took the painting, she tried to say something and I cut her off." The sound of voices in the outer office indicated that the investors had arrived early. Marcus could hear Jennifer greeting them in the lobby, the refined accents of old European money mixing with the more familiar tones of his American board members. In 15 minutes, they would all file into this conference room, expecting to see a carefully curated environment that projected Sterling Industries' sophistication and global readiness. Instead, they would be viewing a stolen masterpiece, whose presence in the room was the result of the owner's ignorance and cultural insensitivity. "What am I going to do?" Marcus asked, more to himself than to Vivian. "You're going to have to tell them the truth," she replied. "And you're going to have to make this right with Maria Esperanza." But first, Marcus had to get through the presentation. As the investors filed into the conference room, their conversations died as they noticed the painting. Lord Pemberton, the lead investor from London, approached the work with obvious recognition and appreciation. "Extraordinary piece," he murmured, studying the signature. "I wasn't aware Sterling Industries had acquired any Esperanza works. This is quite a coup." Marcus felt sweat beading on his forehead, despite the room's carefully controlled temperature. "It's a recent addition to our collection. The presentation proceeded, but Marcus found it impossible to concentrate on financial projections and market analyses, while the painting dominated the room like an accusation. Every time one of the investors commented appreciatively on the Sterling collection or complimented his excellent taste in art, Marcus felt another layer of his professional confidence crumble away. Dr. Catherine Muller from Berlin, an investor who also served on the board of several major European museums, spent considerable time examining the painting during breaks in the presentation. "The provenance on this piece must be fascinating," she said to Marcus during coffee service. "Esperanza works so rarely come to market, and when they do, the story behind them is usually quite remarkable." "Indeed," Marcus replied weakly, having no story to offer beyond his own shameful ignorance. The presentation concluded successfully from a business standpoint. The investors agreed to move forward with the European expansion, impressed by Sterling Industries' financial stability and growth projections. But as they departed, each one made a point of complimenting the Esperanza painting, asking about its acquisition, and expressing hope that they might view other pieces in the Sterling collection during future visits. When the conference room finally emptied, Marcus collapsed into his chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his situation. He had built his career on control, precision, and attention to detail. Yet somehow, the most important discovery of his professional life had happened by accident, through his own cultural blindness and assumption that a cleaning woman could have nothing of value to offer. The afternoon passed in a blur of routine meetings and conference calls, but Marcus's attention was fractured. Every decision he made, every conversation he had, felt hollow and insignificant compared to the knowledge that Maria Esperanza, one of the world's most celebrated artists, had been working invisibly in his building for 18 months, while he remained oblivious to her identity and worth. As evening approached and the building began to empty, Marcus found himself waiting anxiously for the night cleaning crew to arrive. He had spent the day researching everything he could find about Maria Esperanza's career and mysterious disappearance from the art world. The articles painted a picture of an artist at the pinnacle of her success who had suddenly retreated from public life, selling her Barcelona studio and vanishing from the international art scene without explanation. Some speculated that she had suffered a personal tragedy or creative crisis. Others suggested that the pressure of fame and commercial success had driven her to seek anonymity. A few articles mentioned unconfirmed sightings in various cities around the world, Paris, New York, Mexico City, but none had been substantiated. For 25 years, Maria Esperanza had been effectively invisible, her absence from the art world only serving to increase the value and mystique of her existing works. At 8 o'clock, Marcus heard the familiar sounds of the cleaning crew arriving for their night shift. He waited in his office, rehearsing various approaches for the conversation he knew he had to have. How did one apologize to a master artist for treating her as invisible labor? How did one explain that their ignorance had led them to nearly throw away a $1 million masterpiece? When he finally saw Maria's cart roll past his office door, Marcus took a deep breath and stepped into the hallway. "Mrs. Gonzalez," he called out, using the name he had gleaned from employee records that afternoon. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Maria turned, her expression guarded. Up close, Marcus could see the intelligence in her dark eyes that he had somehow missed during 18 months of casual encounters. She was probably in her 70s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back severely and hands that bore the calluses of both physical labor and decades of gripping paintbrushes. "Yes, Mr. Sterling?" "The painting," Marcus began, then stopped, unsure how to proceed. "I know who you are." Something flickered across Maria's face. Resignation, perhaps, or relief that a secret she had carried for so long was finally exposed. She nodded slowly. "I wondered if you would recognize the signature." "I didn't," Marcus admitted. "My interior designer identified it this morning. Maria Esperanza. You're Maria Esperanza." They stood in the hallway for a moment, the weight of this acknowledgment settling between them. Marcus realized that this was probably the first time in 25 years that someone had spoken her real name aloud in professional context. "Why?" Marcus asked finally. "Why are you here cleaning offices when your paintings sell for millions at auction?" Maria was quiet for so long that Marcus wondered if she would answer at all. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of years of carefully maintained secrecy. "Sometimes, Mr. Sterling, we need to disappear to find out who we really are. But your career, your reputation, you walked away from everything. I walked away from a life that was consuming me, Maria corrected. The art world, the galleries, the critics, the constant pressure to produce marketable work. It was killing the very thing that made me want to paint in the first place. Marcus tried to process this. In his world, success was measured by recognition, profit margins, and market dominance. The idea of voluntarily abandoning such achievements was incomprehensible. "So you became a cleaning lady?" Maria's expression hardened slightly. "I became someone who could paint for the joy of it again. Someone who could observe life without being observed. Someone who could work with her hands without having to justify or explain every creative decision to people who saw art as commodity rather than expression." The rebuke was gentle but unmistakable. Marcus realized that his question had revealed exactly the kind of thinking that had driven Maria away from her former life. The assumption that cleaning was somehow beneath an artist, that commercial success was the only meaningful measure of a person's worth. "I'm sorry," he said. "That was ignorant of me. You're not the first person to assume that a cleaning woman couldn't create anything of value." Marcus thought about the previous night, when he had cut off Maria's attempt to speak, dismissing her words as if someone in her position couldn't possibly have anything important to say. The memory burned with shame. "You tried to tell me last night, didn't you, when I took the painting?" "I tried to explain that it wasn't abandoned, that it was mine. And I wouldn't listen." Maria nodded. "You saw the uniform and the cart, and you decided you knew everything you needed to know about me." The truth of this observation hit Marcus like a physical blow. His entire approach to business was built on rapid assessment and decisive action, but in this case, his assumptions had nearly led to the destruction of an irreplaceable work of art. "The painting that was supposed to go in the conference room," Marcus said, working through the timeline. "It was damaged in shipping. I was desperate for a replacement. So you took mine. I thought it was being thrown away. You said you found it in storage." "I lied," Maria said simply. "I keep my work in the storage room because my apartment is too small, and I didn't want to risk damage during transport. When you insisted on taking it, I panicked." Marcus realized that his desperation had put Maria in an impossible position. She couldn't refuse his demand without revealing her identity, but she also couldn't bear to see her work displayed without her consent. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" "Because I've spent 25 years building a life where I didn't have to be Maria Esperanza anymore. Where I could just be Maria, someone who cleaned offices and painted for herself and watched the world without having to perform for it." The sadness in her voice was profound, and Marcus began to understand the magnitude of what she had sacrificed in pursuit of artistic freedom. She had given up fame, fortune, and recognition to reclaim the pure joy of creation, only to have her privacy shattered by his thoughtless actions. "The investors today," Marcus said, remembering the morning's presentations, "they recognized your work. They were asking about provenance and the Sterling collection." Maria closed her eyes as if absorbing a physical blow. So now it begins again. What begins again? The questions, the attention, the assumption that because someone has seen my signature, they own a piece of my story. Marcus felt the full weight of what he had done. In his selfish desperation to impress his investors, he had destroyed something far more valuable than any business deal: Maria's carefully constructed anonymity and peace. "I'll fix this," he said urgently. "I'll tell them the truth. I'll explain that it was all a misunderstanding." "And say what? That you didn't know your cleaning lady was a famous artist? That you took her painting without permission because you assumed she had no right to object?" The questions hung in the air between them, exposing the uncomfortable reality of their situation. Any explanation Marcus offered would reveal his own prejudices and assumptions, while simultaneously destroying Maria's ability to continue her quiet life of artistic freedom. "What do you want me to do?" Marcus asked finally. Maria looked at him for a long moment, as if evaluating whether he was capable of understanding the answer. "I want to finish my shift and go home to my easel, where I've been working on a series that no one will ever see in a gallery, and no one will ever buy at auction, and no one will ever use to impress business associates." "But your talent, my talent belongs to me," Maria interrupted with quiet firmness. "Not to the art market, not to collectors, and certainly not to people who measure its worth by its price tag." Marcus stood in the hallway, humbled by the realization that his worldview had been fundamentally challenged by a woman whose existence he had barely acknowledged for 18 months. Everything he believed about success, recognition, and value had been turned upside down by someone who had chosen invisibility over fame, authenticity over profit. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. "Not just for taking your painting, but for never seeing you. For assuming that someone in your position couldn't have anything important to offer." Maria studied his face, perhaps looking for sincerity behind the words. "Apologies are easy, Mr. Sterling. What matters is what changes." "What would you like to see change?" "I would like to finish my work here without having to worry that tomorrow's newspaper will carry a story about the famous artist-discovered cleaning offices in Seattle. I would like to continue painting without having to field calls from galleries wanting to represent me. I would like to remain Maria Gonzalez, who happens to paint, rather than becoming Maria Esperanza, who happens to clean." The request was both simple and impossible. Marcus knew that Lord Pemberton and Dr. Mueller would likely research the painting further, possibly discovering its true provenance through their museum connections. Once Maria's identity became known in art circles, her anonymity would be permanently shattered. "I can't promise that," Marcus said honestly. "Too many people saw the painting today. People who know art, who might investigate further." "Then you've already taken everything from me," Maria replied, her voice flat with resignation. The accusation hit Marcus harder than any business setback or professional failure he had ever experienced. In his ignorance and desperation, he had destroyed something irreplaceable, not just a painting, but a person's carefully constructed peace and freedom. "Let me try to protect you," he said. "Let me find a way to minimize the exposure, to keep your secret as long as possible." "Why would you do that?" "Because I was wrong. About everything. About you. About what matters. About what success really means." Maria picked up her cleaning supplies, preparing to continue her rounds, but she paused before moving away. "There's something else you should know, Mr. Sterling." "What?" "The painting you displayed today, it's not finished. I was planning to work on it for several more weeks before I considered it complete." Marcus stared at her, processing this information. The work that had so impressed his international investors, that had commanded their respect and admiration, was still in progress according to its creator. "But it's extraordinary as it is." "That's not the point," Maria said patiently. "The point is that you took something that wasn't ready to be seen, displayed it without the artist's permission, and used it to advance your own interests." The ethical implications of his actions became even clearer. He hadn't just borrowed an abandoned painting, he had essentially stolen an artist's work in progress and exploited it for his own benefit. "How do I make this right?" "You can't," Maria said simply, "but you can learn from it." As she wheeled her cart down the hallway, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts, he realized that this conversation had changed something fundamental in his understanding of the world. For the first time in his adult life, he had encountered someone who valued something more than recognition and financial success. Maria had achieved the highest levels of artistic acclaim and voluntarily walked away from it all in pursuit of something money couldn't buy, the freedom to create without compromise. Marcus returned to his office, but found it impossible to concentrate on the emails and reports awaiting his attention. Instead, he found himself researching Maria Esperanza's early career, trying to understand the journey that had led her from international stardom to scrubbing floors in a Seattle office building. The articles from the peak of her career painted a picture of an artist struggling with the commercial pressures of success. In interviews from the late 1990s, she had expressed frustration with gallery owners who wanted her to repeat her most successful works, critics who tried to categorize and limit her artistic evolution, and collectors who treated her paintings as investment opportunities rather than expressions of human experience. "I became a brand instead of an artist," she had said in what turned out to be her final published interview. "People stopped seeing my work and started seeing dollar signs. I stopped painting what moved me and started painting what sold. That's not art, that's manufacturing." 6 months after that interview, Maria Esperanza had closed her Barcelona studio, canceled her upcoming exhibitions, and disappeared from the art world entirely. Galleries that represented her work reported that she had terminated all contracts and refused to provide forwarding information. The sudden withdrawal had only increased demand for her existing pieces, with auction prices rising steadily over the following decades. Reading these articles, Marcus began to understand that Maria's decision to become invisible hadn't been an act of defeat or creative crisis. It had been an act of artistic liberation. She had chosen authenticity over acclaim, personal satisfaction over public recognition. In doing so, she had accomplished something that eluded most successful people. She had defined success on her own terms. The realization was profoundly unsettling for Marcus, whose entire identity was built on external validation and competitive achievement. He had never questioned whether his definition of success might be limiting him, whether his focus on recognition and profit might be costing him something more valuable. As the night wore on, Marcus found himself wandering the empty floors of his building, seeing it through different eyes. The marble lobbies and designer furniture that had always represented achievement now seemed hollow, designed more to impress visitors than to serve any meaningful purpose. The awards and photographs in his office told the story of a man who had confused accumulation with accomplishment, recognition with fulfillment. When he encountered Maria again near the elevators, finishing her cleaning rounds for the night, Marcus felt compelled to continue their conversation. "I've been reading about your earlier career," he said. Maria paused, her expression wary. "And? I think I understand why you left." "Do you?" Marcus chose his words carefully, aware that his comprehension was still incomplete, but genuine. "You didn't want to be a commodity. You wanted to be an artist." "It's more than that," Maria said after a moment. "I wanted to remember why I started painting in the first place. When you become successful, everyone has opinions about what you should create, how you should develop your style, which direction your career should take. After a while, you can't hear your own voice anymore. So you walked away from everything to find it again. I walked away from everything that was drowning it out." Marcus considered this, thinking about his own career trajectory. When had he last made a decision based purely on his own interests rather than market expectations or competitive positioning? Do you regret it? Which part? Leaving? Or being discovered again? Either. Both. Maria was quiet for a long time, seemingly weighing her response. "I don't regret leaving. These 25 years have been the most creatively fulfilling of my life. I've painted more, and better, than I ever did when I was famous, but I do regret that my privacy is about to end." "Maybe it doesn't have to. You said yourself that too many people saw the painting today." Marcus had been thinking about this problem throughout the evening, and he believed he had found a possible solution. What if the painting disappeared? Maria looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" "What if I told them it was stolen? That someone broke in overnight and took it? The building has security cameras, but I could arrange for there to be a blind spot, a plausible explanation for how someone could have accessed the conference room and removed it." "You would lie to your investors?" "I would protect someone who deserves protection." Maria studied his face, perhaps looking for ulterior motives or hidden agendas. "Why would you do that for me?" Marcus had been asking himself the same question. The answer wasn't entirely clear, but it felt important to try to articulate it. "Because for 18 months I walked past you every day and never really saw you. Because when you tried to tell me the truth about the painting, I dismissed you. Because I took something that belonged to you and used it for my own purposes without asking permission. And because..." He paused, struggling with the unfamiliar territory of genuine self-reflection. "Because I think you might understand something about success that I don't." "Which is?" "That it's possible to have everything the world says you should want and still feel empty." The observation surprised Marcus as he spoke it, but he realized it was true. Despite his wealth, recognition, and professional achievements, he often felt as if he was performing a role rather than living an authentic life. The endless pursuit of growth, profit, and market dominance had become an end in itself, disconnected from any deeper sense of purpose or satisfaction. "Success without meaning is just elaborate failure," Maria said quietly. "Is that why you gave it all up?" "I gave up the performance of success to find the reality of fulfillment." Marcus found himself envying Maria's clarity and courage. She had recognized that her public life was incompatible with her creative integrity and had been willing to sacrifice everything external to preserve something internal. He couldn't imagine making such a choice, but he was beginning to understand why someone might. "The stolen painting story," Maria said, returning to his proposed solution. "It would protect me, but it would make you look incompetent. Your investors would question your security, your judgment. Marcus shrugged. "I'll manage. I'm more concerned about preserving your ability to paint in peace." For the first time in their conversation, Maria smiled, a small, genuine expression that transformed her face. "You're learning, Mr. Sterling." "Learning what?" "That some things matter more than appearance." As Maria gathered her equipment to leave for the night, Marcus realized that this conversation had been the most meaningful exchange he'd had in years. It had challenged assumptions he'd never thought to question and introduced him to a completely different way of thinking about success, purpose, and authenticity. "Maria," he said as she prepared to board the elevator, "would you be willing to teach me about art? Not as an investment or status symbol, but as whatever it really is." She paused, her hand on the elevator call button. "What makes you think you're ready to learn?" "I don't know if I am. But I know I want to try." Maria considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Saturday mornings, 7 o'clock. There's a small gallery in Pioneer Square that opens early for serious viewers. If you can find it, and if you can spend 2 hours looking at art without thinking about its market value, then maybe we can talk about what painting really means. I'll be there." "We'll see," Maria said as the elevator doors closed. Marcus stood alone in the hallway, surrounded by the trappings of his success but feeling as if he was seeing his world clearly for the first time. The building around him suddenly felt like a monument to his own limitations, rather than his achievements. But for the first time in years, that recognition felt like the beginning of something, rather than the end. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp, autumn air that made Seattle feel like a city reborn. Marcus stood outside the small gallery in Pioneer Square at exactly 7 o'clock, having spent the better part of Friday evening wandering the cobblestone streets until he found the unassuming storefront Maria had mentioned. The gallery's name, Liminal Spaces, was etched in simple black letters on frosted glass, and through the windows he could see soft lighting illuminating what appeared to be a carefully curated collection of contemporary works. Marcus had arrived 15 minutes early, partly from nervousness and partly from a lifetime habit of punctuality in business meetings. But as he waited, watching the morning light shift across the historic brick buildings, he realized this wasn't a business meeting at all. It was something entirely foreign to his experience, an appointment with no agenda, no desired outcome beyond learning something he couldn't yet articulate. When Maria appeared at precisely 7 o'clock, she looked different outside the context of Sterling Industries. Gone was the faded blue uniform, replaced by dark jeans, a charcoal sweater, and a worn leather jacket that spoke of years of careful use. Her silver-streaked hair was loose around her shoulders instead of pulled back severely, and without the industrial cleaning cart, she moved with a grace that Marcus had somehow failed to notice during their 18 months of casual encounters. "You found it," she said, approaching the gallery entrance. "It wasn't easy. There's no website, no advertising that I could find." "That's intentional." Robert Chen, the owner, believes that people who are meant to find art will make the effort to seek it out. As if summoned by the mention of his name, a slight man in his 60s opened the gallery door from within. Robert Chen had the kind of weathered face that suggested decades of close observation, and when he smiled at Maria, it was with the warmth of genuine friendship. "Maria, punctual as always," he said, then turned to Marcus with curious but welcoming eyes. "And you must be the student she mentioned." "Student?" The word struck Marcus as oddly appropriate. For the first time in his adult life, he was entering a situation where his wealth, connections, and business acumen were irrelevant qualifications. "Robert, this is Marcus Sterling," Maria said simply, offering no additional context or credentials. Robert nodded and stepped aside to let them enter. "Welcome to Liminal Spaces, Marcus. The coffee is fresh, and the morning light on the east wall is particularly beautiful today." The gallery's interior was nothing like the sterile, intimidating spaces Marcus associated with the art world. Instead of white walls and harsh lighting, the rooms felt warm and lived in, with natural light streaming through carefully positioned windows and comfortable seating areas that invited contemplation rather than rushed viewing. The works on display ranged from painting and sculpture to mixed media pieces that defied easy categorization, but everything shared a sense of emotional authenticity that was immediately apparent even to Marcus's untrained eye. "The first rule of really seeing art," Maria said as they moved toward the east wall Robert had mentioned, is to forget everything you think you know about it. Marcus found this instruction more challenging than expected. His mind automatically began assessing the pieces they passed, estimating values, considering investment potential, wondering about the artist's market positions. These thoughts felt intrusive now, like noise interfering with a conversation he was trying to hear. How do I do that? Start by looking without labeling. Don't ask if something is good or bad, expensive or cheap, famous or unknown. Just ask what it makes you feel. They stopped before a large canvas that dominated the east wall, and Marcus immediately understood what Robert had meant about the morning light. The painting seemed to absorb and reflect the natural illumination in ways that changed its appearance moment by moment. The work depicted an urban landscape, but not in any photorealistic sense. Instead, the artist had captured the emotional texture of city life, the loneliness of crowded spaces, the beauty of anonymous human moments, the way light and shadow could transform familiar places into something mysterious. Marcus stared at the painting, trying to silence the commercial calculations that arose automatically in his mind. Gradually, he became aware of something else, a response that had nothing to do with market value or artistic reputation. The work made him think of early mornings in his own building, those moments before the business day began, when the empty spaces felt pregnant with possibility. It reminded him of walking through downtown Seattle on summer evenings, observing the lives of strangers through lit windows and wondering what stories were unfolding behind each one. "What do you see?" Maria asked after they had stood in silence for several minutes. "I see." Marcus paused, struggling to articulate something he had never tried to express before. "I see the way cities feel when you're really paying attention to them. Not just the buildings and traffic, but the emotional atmosphere, the weight of all those individual lives happening simultaneously." Maria nodded approvingly. "Now you're beginning to see art instead of just looking at it." They moved through the gallery slowly, Maria occasionally offering observations but mostly allowing Marcus to engage with each piece on his own terms. Robert appeared periodically with fresh coffee or to adjust lighting, but otherwise left them to their exploration. The absence of sales pressure or educational lecturing allowed Marcus to experience something he had never encountered in previous gallery visits: genuine curiosity about what the artists were trying to communicate. In front of a series of small, intimate paintings depicting everyday objects, a coffee cup on a windowsill, work boots by a door, a child's toy abandoned on a park bench, Marcus found himself unexpectedly moved. The technical execution was masterful, but what struck him was the artist's ability to find profound beauty in the most ordinary moments of human existence. "These remind me of my grandmother's house," he said without thinking. She had this way of making everything feel significant, even washing dishes or folding laundry. Like every small action was part of something larger and meaningful. "Art has the power to reconnect us with that sense of significance," Maria replied. "It reminds us that attention itself is a form of love." The observation resonated deeply with Marcus, who realized that his entire professional life was built on a kind of strategic inattention, moving quickly from one priority to the next, always focused on outcomes rather than processes, treating each moment as merely a step towards some future achievement. "Is that why you paint?" he asked. "Partly. Painting forces me to pay attention in ways that nothing else does. When I'm working on a canvas, I have to really see, not just glance or assess, but truly observe the play of light and shadow, the way colors interact, the emotional content of a particular gesture or expression. It's a form of meditation, I suppose." They spent nearly 3 hours in the gallery, far longer than Marcus had anticipated. By the time they emerged into the late morning sunshine, he felt as if he had undergone some kind of perceptual shift. The world around him seemed more vivid, more layered with meaning than it had when he'd entered. "Thank you," he said as they stood on the cobblestone street. "That was educational." "Education suggests learning facts," Maria corrected gently. "What happened in there was more like remembering something you already knew but had forgotten." Marcus considered this as they walked toward the parking area where he had left his car. The morning had challenged assumptions he hadn't even realized he held about art, beauty, and the purpose of careful observation. But more than that, it had introduced him to a way of being in the world that prioritized presence over productivity, depth over efficiency. "Would you be willing to do this again?" he asked as they reached his BMW. "Are you asking as Marcus Sterling, CEO of Sterling Industries, or as someone genuinely interested in learning to see?" The question forced Marcus to examine his motivations. Was this simply another form of self-improvement? Another skill to acquire for competitive advantage? Or was he genuinely drawn to something that had no immediate practical application? I don't know, he answered honestly. Maybe both. But I think what happened in there matters in ways I can't fully articulate yet. Maria studied his face, perhaps looking for signs of sincerity or calculation. There's a studio space in Georgetown where several local artists work, she said finally. Thursday evenings, some of us gather there to paint and talk about our work. It's not a class or a formal program, just artists sharing space and conversation. If you're serious about understanding what art really is, you might find it instructive. Marcus felt a flutter of nervousness at the prospect of being surrounded by actual artists, people for whom creativity was not a hobby or investment strategy, but a central organizing principle of their lives. Would I be welcome there? I'm not an artist. You don't have to be an artist to appreciate the process. But you do have to be willing to listen more than you speak and to value questions more than answers. I can try. Maria gave him an address in Georgetown and told him to arrive at 7 o'clock Thursday evening. As she walked away toward the bus stop, Marcus realized that this brief morning had opened a door to a world he had never known existed. A realm where success was measured not by external recognition, but by the depth of one's engagement with the fundamental mysteries of human experience. The week that followed was unlike any in Marcus's recent memory. The daily routines of Sterling Industries continued, meetings with department heads, reviews of quarterly projections, negotiations with vendors and partners. But these activities felt strangely hollow, as if he were performing the role of CEO rather than authentically inhabiting it. Wednesday brought an unexpected development that reminded Marcus of the delicate situation he had created. Lord Pemberton's assistant called to request high-resolution photographs of the Esperanza painting for an article about contemporary corporate art collections that would appear in Artforum International. Dr. Muller from Berlin had also expressed interest in including the work in a traveling exhibition about Spanish maritime painting that her museum was organizing. Marcus found himself in the impossible position of having to deflect these requests without arousing suspicion about the painting's provenance or availability. He instructed Jennifer to respond that the Sterling collection was under review for insurance purposes and that no photography or loans would be possible until the evaluation was complete. How long should I tell them the review will take? Jennifer asked. Marcus realized he had no idea how to resolve this situation long-term. The painting was still hanging in the conference room, where it continued to impress visitors and generate exactly the kind of attention that would eventually expose Maria's identity. Tell them we'll have more information next quarter. That evening, Marcus found himself walking through his Belltown penthouse, seeing his own art collection with new eyes. The walls were filled with works he had purchased, based on investment potential or status considerations. Blue-chip artists whose names carried weight in certain social circles, pieces selected more for their market performance than their emotional impact. Looking at them now, after his morning in the gallery with Maria, they felt like expensive furniture rather than meaningful expressions of human creativity. He paused before a large abstract work by a contemporary artist whose auction records he had studied carefully before purchasing. The painting had cost him nearly $200,000 and had been featured in Architectural Digest when they profiled his penthouse. But staring at it now, Marcus realized he felt nothing. The work was technically accomplished and commercially successful, but it had no personal resonance, no ability to move him or change his perspective on anything meaningful. The contrast with his experience at Liminal Spaces was stark. The paintings there had been created by artists whose names he didn't recognize, whose market value was probably minimal, but whose work had the power to make him see his own life differently. He began to understand that he had been collecting trophies rather than art, accumulating symbols of wealth rather than sources of genuine aesthetic experience. Thursday evening found Marcus standing outside a converted warehouse in Georgetown, listening to the sounds of conversation and music drifting through industrial windows. The building housed several artist studios, and the communal space where Maria had invited him was on the third floor. As he climbed the stairs, Marcus felt the same nervousness he had experienced before important business presentations, but with an additional layer of uncertainty about whether he belonged in this environment at all. The studio space was everything his corporate offices were not: chaotic, lived in, filled with the accumulated evidence of ongoing creative work. Canvases in various stages of completion leaned against exposed brick walls, and the air carried the distinctive smell of oil paint and turpentine. A dozen artists of various ages were scattered throughout the space, some working quietly at easels, others engaged in animated conversation about technique or artistic philosophy. Maria was standing near the far windows, working on a canvas that depicted the Seattle waterfront during a storm. Even from across the room, Marcus could see the emotional intensity she was capturing. Not just the visual drama of the weather, but something deeper about the relationship between human civilization and natural forces. "You came," she said when she noticed his arrival, setting down her brush and wiping her hands on a paint-stained cloth. "I said I would." People say many things. Follow-through is rarer. Maria introduced Marcus to the other artists present, and he was struck by the diversity of backgrounds and approaches represented in the room. There was Sarah, a former software engineer who had left tech to pursue sculpture. David, a retired teacher whose watercolors captured the changing light of Pacific Northwest landscapes. Elena, a young woman whose mixed media installations explored themes of cultural identity and displacement. What unified them was not commercial success or formal training, but a shared commitment to using art as a means of understanding and responding to the world around them. Their conversations moved fluidly between technical discussions of materials and methods to philosophical explorations of what art could and should accomplish in contemporary society. "Marcus is learning to see," Maria explained to the group, and several artists nodded knowingly. "Hardest thing about really seeing," said Tom, a painter in his 70s whose work filled one corner of the studio, "is giving up the illusion that you already know what you're looking at." The observation struck Marcus as applicable beyond art. How much of his professional life was built on the assumption that he already understood markets, people, and situations that might reveal entirely different dimensions if he approached them with genuine curiosity rather than confident assessment. As the evening progressed, Marcus found himself drawn into conversations that challenged his basic assumptions about creativity, purpose, and success. Elena talked about her decision to pursue art, despite her family's expectations that she enter a more financially stable profession. David described the liberation he had felt upon retiring from teaching and finally having time to develop his artistic vision without external pressures. "The art world wants to categorize everything," Sarah explained as she worked on a sculpture made from reclaimed industrial materials. "This is contemporary, this is traditional, this sells, this doesn't." But when you're actually making work, those categories disappear. You're just trying to solve problems and express something that matters to you. Marcus watched Sarah's hands as she spoke, noting the confidence and precision with which she shaped the metal components of her piece. There was something deeply satisfying about witnessing the transformation of raw materials into meaningful form, the way technical skill combined with creative vision to produce something that had never existed before. "Can I try that?" he asked impulsively, gesturing toward a small section of the sculpture that appeared unfinished. Sarah looked surprised, but handed him a pair of pliers and showed him how to bend the wire she was incorporating into the work. The physical act of shaping the material was more difficult than Marcus had anticipated, requiring a combination of strength, delicacy, and spatial reasoning that felt entirely different from the intellectual challenges of business decision-making. "It's harder than it looks," he said after several minutes of fumbling with the wire. "Everything worthwhile is," Sarah replied, "but that's part of what makes it satisfying. You have to earn every small success." As the evening wound down and artists began cleaning their brushes and covering their work, Marcus realized that something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of what constituted meaningful activity. The hours he had spent in the studio felt more engaging and energizing than most of his recent business meetings, despite producing nothing that could be measured in traditional terms of productivity or profit. "What did you think?" Maria asked as they prepared to leave. "I think I've been confusing motion with progress," Marcus replied. "And achievement with fulfillment. Those are easy mistakes to make, especially when you're successful by conventional measures." As they walked toward the elevator, Marcus found himself reluctant to return to his regular life. The studio had felt like a refuge from the constant pressure to perform, compete, and accumulate that defined his normal existence. "Maria," he said as they reached the parking garage, "I need to ask you something about the painting." Her expression became guarded. "What about it?" "The requests are continuing. Magazine features, exhibition opportunities, collector inquiries. I've been deflecting them, but I can't do that indefinitely without raising suspicions." Maria was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus could see her weighing the implications of continued exposure. "What do you suggest?" "I think we need to remove the painting from the building. Permanently. And tell people what?" Marcus had been thinking about this problem throughout the week, and he believed he had found a solution that would protect Maria while minimizing damage to his own reputation. "I tell them that after further research, we discovered the work was not properly authenticated, that we've returned it to the original source pending verification of provenance. It's embarrassing for me, but it removes the painting from public view and ends the inquiries." "You would sacrifice your reputation to protect mine?" "It's not really a sacrifice," Marcus said, surprising himself with the honesty of the statement. "I'm beginning to think my reputation is built on things that don't actually matter very much." Maria studied his face in the dim garage lighting, perhaps looking for signs of calculation or hidden agenda. "You're changing, Marcus Sterling." "I hope so." The following morning, Marcus arrived at Sterling Industries early and went directly to the conference room. The Esperanza painting dominated the space as dramatically as it had during the investor presentation, its emotional intensity undiminished by familiarity. Looking at it now, Marcus could see elements he had missed initially, subtle details in the wave structure, nuanced color relationships that created depth and movement, the way Maria had captured not just the visual appearance of the storm, but its psychological impact. He carefully removed the painting from the wall and carried it to his office, where he wrapped it in protective cloth and placed it in a secure closet. Then he called Vivian Cross and asked her to come in immediately to discuss a situation with the conference room artwork. When Vivian arrived an hour later, Marcus explained the cover story he had developed. The painting's authentication had been questioned by experts, and Sterling Industries was removing it from display pending further investigation. He would need her help in crafting a public explanation that would end the inquiries while minimizing reputational damage to the company. "Marcus, this is a disaster," Vivian said after hearing the details. "The investors will think you're either incompetent or dishonest. Let them think what they want. I made an error in judgment, and now I'm correcting it." "But why? If the work is authentic, which we both know it is, why not simply provide the proper documentation?" Marcus realized he couldn't explain his decision without revealing Maria's identity and her desire for anonymity. The truth would protect his reputation, but destroy hers. Some things are more important than avoiding embarrassment. Vivian stared at him, as if he had announced his intention to abandon capitalism altogether. "Since when do you prioritize anything over the company's image?" "Since I learned that image and substance aren't the same thing?" The conversation with Vivian was the first of several difficult discussions Marcus would have over the following days. Lord Pemberton's assistant called to express disappointment about the authentication issues and to suggest that Sterling Industries might benefit from consulting with more reputable art advisors in the future. Dr. Mueller sent a polite but cool email withdrawing her exhibition request and noting that proper provenance research should always precede public display of significant artworks. Each criticism stung, but Marcus found the discomfort more bearable than he had expected. The damage to his reputation was real but finite, whereas the harm to Maria's privacy would have been irreversible. For the first time in his professional life, he had prioritized someone else's well-being over his own advancement. And the experience was both humbling and oddly liberating. By the end of the week, Marcus had crafted a formal statement acknowledging the authentication error and announcing Sterling Industries' commitment to more rigorous art acquisition procedures in the future. The statement was professional and appropriately contrite, but it generated exactly the kind of negative attention he had spent his career trying to avoid. Friday evening found Marcus back in the Georgetown studio, working alongside Sarah on basic metalworking techniques while Maria painted nearby. The routine physical activity in the absence of external pressures created a mental space unlike anything he experienced in his normal professional environment. "How are you handling the fallout from the painting situation?" Maria asked during a break in her work. "Better than I expected. It's strange. I thought damaging my reputation would feel catastrophic, but mostly it just feels like clearing away something that was never very substantial to begin with. Reputation is what other people think they know about you. Character is who you actually are when no one is watching." Marcus considered this distinction as he struggled to join two pieces of metal without damaging either one. His reputation had been built on careful image management and strategic positioning, but what did any of that have to do with his actual qualities as a human being? "I think I've been confusing the two," he said. "Most successful people do. It's an occupational hazard." As the weeks passed, Marcus found himself spending more time in the Georgetown studio and less time on the social obligations that had filled his evenings for years. Gallery openings and industry events began to feel performative and hollow compared to the genuine conversations and collaborative work he was experiencing with the artists. His business continued to thrive despite the minor scandal over the authentication error, but Marcus noticed that his approach to leadership was shifting in subtle ways. He began asking more questions and making fewer pronouncements. He spent more time listening to employees at all levels of the organization, particularly those whose perspectives had been marginalized or overlooked in the past. During a staff meeting in late November, Janet Rodriguez from the cleaning crew approached him with a suggestion about improving the building's recycling program. In the past, Marcus would have directed her to speak with facilities management, but instead he found himself genuinely curious about her ideas and eager to implement changes that would reduce waste throughout the organization. "You're different lately," Jennifer observed after the meeting. "More present, I suppose." Marcus realized she was right. The art education he was receiving from Maria and the other studio artists was teaching him not just to see paintings differently, but to pay attention more carefully to everything around him. The conversations he was having with employees felt more substantial because he was actually listening rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. December brought an unexpected opportunity that would test Marcus's evolving values in a very public way. The Seattle Art Museum announced its annual corporate sponsor gala, and Sterling Industries had been invited to serve as the event's primary patron. The sponsorship would cost nearly $500,000 and would involve giving a keynote address about the role of art in business to an audience of the city's cultural elite. In previous years, Marcus would have accepted such an invitation immediately, recognizing the networking opportunities and prestige associated with the event. But now, the prospect of delivering a speech about art to people who might view it primarily as commodity or status symbol felt deeply uncomfortable. "You should decline," Maria suggested, when he mentioned the invitation during one of their Thursday evening studio sessions. "Why?" "Because you're not ready to speak authentically about art to that audience, and anything inauthentic will undermine the progress you've made." Marcus knew she was right, but declining such a prominent invitation would send a message throughout Seattle's business community that he was withdrawing from his expected social obligations. "What if instead of giving a speech about art and business, I talked about what I've learned from artists about seeing and attention? You think they would be interested in that?" "I don't know, but it would be honest." Maria considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Honesty is always preferable to performance. But be prepared for the audience to resist messages that challenge their assumptions." Marcus spent the following weeks crafting a speech unlike any he had given before. Instead of discussing art as investment or cultural capital, he focused on what his education with Maria and the studio artists had taught him about the value of careful observation, the importance of prioritizing process over outcome, and the ways that attention itself could be a form of love and respect. The night of the gala arrived gray and rainy, typical Seattle winter weather that seemed to emphasize the warmth and elegance of the museum's interior. Marcus arrived to find the grand hall filled with the city's cultural establishment, museum board members, gallery owners, collectors, and business leaders, who had built their reputations on their ability to identify and acquire valuable art. When he was introduced as the evening's keynote speaker, Marcus took the podium with the same nervous energy he had felt during his first visit to the Georgetown studio. But instead of the familiar confidence that came from delivering well-rehearsed corporate messages, he felt the vulnerability of someone about to share something genuinely personal. 6 months ago, he began, I thought I understood what art was for. I collected pieces that would impress visitors, supported cultural institutions that would enhance my company's reputation, and attended events like this one because they were expected elements of corporate success. The audience listened politely, perhaps expecting a conventional speech about the business value of cultural investment. But then I met someone who taught me that I had been looking at art without really seeing it, that I had been treating creativity as commodity rather than communication. Marcus went on to describe his education at the hands of Maria and the other artists, though he was careful to protect Maria's identity and specific circumstances. He talked about learning to observe without immediately categorizing, to value questions more than answers, to understand that some of the most important human activities produced no measurable outcomes. The artists I've been privileged to know don't create work to impress audiences or generate profits, he said. They create because paying attention to the world and responding to it through their chosen medium is how they make meaning out of existence. That's not a business model. It's a way of being human. As Marcus spoke, he could see the audience's reaction shifting from polite attention to genuine engagement. Some faces showed confusion or skepticism, but others reflected recognition and appreciation for perspectives they rarely heard in their usual cultural circles. I used to think that successful people were those who accumulated the most impressive collections, Marcus continued. Now I think successful people might be those who develop the most profound ability to see what's actually in front of them. When he concluded his remarks, the applause was warm but somewhat uncertain, as if the audience wasn't sure how to categorize what they had just heard. During the cocktail reception that followed, Marcus found himself engaged in conversations unlike any he had experienced at previous cultural events. Dr. Patricia Williams, the museum's chief curator, approached him near the end of the evening. "That was an unusual speech for a corporate sponsor," she said with a slight smile. "I hope it wasn't inappropriate." On the contrary, it was refreshing. Too often these events become echo chambers, where everyone agrees that art is important without anyone examining why. You challenged people to think more deeply about what cultural engagement actually means. As Marcus drove home through the quiet Seattle streets, he reflected on how much his relationship with public speaking had changed. In the past, successful presentations had left him energized by the positive response and the networking opportunities they created. Tonight, he felt a different kind of satisfaction, the contentment that came from sharing something authentic rather than performing a role. The new year brought opportunities to implement the perspective shifts Marcus had been experiencing in his personal education with Maria and the studio artists. Sterling Industries launched a program to support local artists through workspace grants and exhibition opportunities, but with a focus on providing creative freedom rather than expecting promotional benefits for the company. Marcus also began restructuring his own art collection, quietly selling pieces that had been acquired for status or investment purposes, and replacing them with works by local artists whose vision resonated with him personally. The financial value of his collection decreased significantly, but its emotional impact on his daily life increased proportionally. "You're becoming a real collector," Maria observed when she visited his penthouse in March to see the changes he had made. "What's the difference between a real collector and what I was before? Real collectors love the work they live with. Everything else is just expensive decoration." As spring arrived in Seattle, Marcus realized that his relationship with success had been fundamentally altered by his education in seeing and attention. Sterling Industries continued to grow and prosper, but Marcus found himself making decisions based more on their alignment with his values than their potential for profit maximization. When a major shipping contract became available that would require Sterling Industries to transport goods produced under questionable labor conditions, Marcus declined the opportunity, despite its substantial financial value. The decision confused some board members and competitors, but it felt consistent with the principles he had been developing through his artistic education. "You're thinking like an artist now," Maria said when he described the situation during one of their Thursday evening studio sessions. "What do you mean?" "You're prioritizing integrity over outcome. That's what artists do when they refuse to compromise their vision for commercial success." Marcus had never thought of business decisions in artistic terms, but he began to see parallels between creative integrity and ethical leadership. Both required the courage to prioritize long-term authenticity over short-term advantage. By summer, Marcus's transformation had become apparent to everyone in his professional and personal circles. Colleagues noticed his increased attention to employee perspectives and his willingness to make decisions based on principles rather than purely financial considerations. Friends observed his withdrawal from the social obligations that had previously consumed his evenings, and his increasing involvement with local arts organizations. The most significant change, however, was in Marcus's relationship with Maria herself. What had begun as a guilty attempt to make amends for his cultural insensitivity had evolved into a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared curiosity about the role of attention and creativity in meaningful life. On a warm evening in late August, as they worked side by side in the Georgetown studio, Maria made an observation that crystallized everything Marcus had been learning. "You know, when I first met you, I thought you were just another businessman who confused accumulation with achievement. But you've learned something that most people never figure out, which is that the quality of your attention determines the quality of your experience. Everything else is just details." Marcus looked around the studio at the artists absorbed in their work, each one engaged in the kind of focused, purposeful activity that had become increasingly central to his own sense of satisfaction and meaning. 6 months earlier, he would have seen their evening as unproductive time spent on unmarketable activities. Now he understood it as perhaps the most important kind of work a person could do, the ongoing effort to see clearly, respond authentically, and create something meaningful out of the raw materials of existence. As he walked to his car that evening, Marcus reflected on the chain of events that had led him to this point. A damaged painting, a desperate business need, and his own cultural assumptions had combined to reveal the presence of an extraordinary artist working invisibly in his building. But more than that, they had introduced him to a way of being in the world that prioritized depth over surface, meaning over appearance, and authentic engagement over performative success. The cleaning lady's painting had indeed changed everything, not because of its market value or the prestige it could have brought, but because discovering it had forced Marcus to examine the difference between what he had been pursuing and what actually mattered. In learning to see Maria's art, he had begun to see everything else more clearly as well. Standing in the parking garage, looking up at the Seattle skyline illuminated against the darkening summer sky, Marcus realized that the most valuable thing he had gained from the entire experience wasn't knowledge about art, or even the friendship he had developed with Maria and the other artists. It was the capacity to be present in his own life rather than simply managing it, to experience genuine curiosity about the world around him, rather than just strategizing how to exploit it. The signature at the bottom of that stormy seascape had indeed made him freeze, but not because he suddenly understood its monetary worth. It had stopped him because it forced him to confront the vast difference between the life he had been living and the life that was actually available to him. That recognition, more than any business achievement or financial milestone, felt like the beginning of real success. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.